Heads must have rolled Tuesday night at Fox News as a Chyron aired in the 8 o'clock hour referred to President Biden as, quote, a wannabe dictator. The network, which carried Donald Trump's post-arraignment speech live, showed a split screen of the former president and Biden, who was also speaking from the White House, and ran a graphic that read, quote, wannabe dictator speaks at the White House after having his political rival arrested. Fox News has since addressed the incident, telling The Hill Wednesday that the Chyron was taken down immediately and was addressed.
Meanwhile, the twice-indicted former president is cashing in on his arraignment. According to Politico, the Trump team raked in $2 million at its first campaign fundraiser just hours after Trump was arraigned in Miami. All right. I think somebody went rogue here, put up an unapproved Chyron. You know, that happens on all networks. Fox admitted that that was not okay and took action against that. My question is, wannabe dictator? He's just a dictator.
I mean, look, so there's this part of this that's the story. You know, they say it was handled. Is the person being fired? Who is the person? There might be some follow-up there. I'm not especially invested in whatever happens, but it's probably a low-level employee there. But this broader question of the optics of Joe Biden appointing a special prosecutor to go after the leading candidate in the Republican race, it is bad. It's giving imprisoning Lula da Silva. It is evocative of the things that America says sets it apart from other countries in the world, whether or not that's a reasonable interpretation of events. That's what America holds itself to, a higher standard. And so many Democrats and people who are frustrated with Trump for legitimate reasons are pretending as though the fact that Trump uniquely obstructed evidence in ways that are distinguishable from the other people who also have document retention issues, Mike Pence, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden himself, it doesn't get to the heart of the issue, which is that the lesser crimes, if you will, the lesser violations of the Espionage Act or these document retention rules, these classified document rules, are still prosecutable. And the choice was made not to prosecute those important political figures the way that whistleblowers, journalists have been prosecuted for doing much less in the past.
The little guys get prosecuted. The elites, the political figures in both parties avoided this kind of scrutiny, and it took someone as clumsy as Trump, and and as reviled by the justice system and the national security world and the current administration, and they're going to do everything they can to get him. And yes, there's a lot of strength, as we've discussed, to the underlying case. It's, I think, very frustrating, even for people who really like Trump's policies, at least, that he put himself in this position and put them in this position of having to defend conduct that is actually really difficult to defend and feels very unnecessary because there was nothing at stake here, and there was no, this wasn't Trump falling on a sword for some major political victory. This wasn't, you know what, we're going to suffer in the ballot box, but we're going to get abortion banned. Like that kind of, bargain you make when you're ultimately the goal is to achieve conservative policies, not to just win. But you don't have to lose in order to not serve any good political cause either, which seems what happened here. But all that said, still, it will be hard to get around the optics of attempting to jail the main political rival of the president, a step we have never taken before.
Well, there's Eugene Debs, but a major, the main political rival.
And that was a sordid and scandalous and embarrassing, clear violation of civil liberties. Woodrow Wilson jailing Eugene V. Debs for objecting, for protesting and circulating leaflets opposing America's entry into World War I, a conflict now in hindsight that I think that most people agree was at best quite unnecessary and caused massive death and devastation for very little reason.
This creeping kind of authoritarianism is everywhere. The Espionage Act has been something protested historically by liberals and civil libertarians up until the moment that it can maybe get Trump. Now everybody seems to be turning a blind eye. There have been expansions of domestic terrorism laws that, as we discussed on this show, have been applied to the Stop Cop City protesters in Atlanta, where protesters who were handing out leaflets were arrested under domestic terrorism charges, basic First Amendment rights there, that there were 3 members who were raising bail funds for arrested protesters who had a SWAT SWAT team and military equipment sent to their house and broke down were swatted and arrested as a consequence of simply raising bail funds and charged under these domestic terrorism laws. And now at the highest level in our government, you have a special prosecutor who has been assigned to investigate Trump specifically. And, Alan Dershowitz made this very interesting point in a recent article he wrote earlier this week, that there's a world where you could designate a special prosecutor to look at a category of crimes, to look into all of the document retention issues. But there is something inherently targeted about assigning a special prosecutor to one individual, because as Alan Dershowitz said when he was on our show earlier this week, show me the man and I can show you the crime. And so, Donald Trump spent so much of the last 4 years or so casting doubt on the credibility of the 2020 election. Wrongly, he said a lot of incorrect lies about the legitimacy of Biden's victory in 2020. But looking forward to 2024, you're basically setting him up for a narrative that I think is going to be destructive to democracy, where he's going to have a point about the legal system being weaponized to interfere with the democratic process because Joe Biden wasn't up to fighting him mano a mano.
Right. Yeah, and that's what we're headed toward. And I wanted to mention, as you brought up the Cop City thing again, you'll like this, Briahna. The Libertarian Party of Georgia has opposed. They put out a statement condemning the Cop City project.
Oh, terrific! They're doing better than Raphael Warnock and a lot of Democratic leadership in that state.
Also wanted to mention there was a vote just in terms of political persecution kind of thing. There was a vote in the House to censor Adam Schiff for his Russiagate stuff. It failed, and Thomas Massie and some other Republicans joined Democrats in voting against it. And what Massie said is that this was going to, if they voted for this, it was also recommending like a $15 million fine for Adam Schiff. And Thomas Massie said he would vote to censor or condemn what Adam Schiff did with respect to Russiagate, but not, the House can't pass a motion that conflicts with the U.S. Constitution, and they can't fine one specific person. That would be crazy to do that.
Right.
So they opposed it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think this is an increasingly polarizing issue for people in a way that is not partisan at all. But
so I like to see people. I like to see members of Congress thinking through the consequences of just giving the government more broad power to punish political enemies.
Exactly.
Let's think about how this ends up getting used against you and violates principles.
Yeah, well, progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tore into Republican lawmakers who were saying Trump is a victim of a two-tiered justice system, calling it an insult to people of color. In an interview with The Independent, she said, quote, "The idea that there's a two-tiered justice system and somehow the person on the short end of the stick is one of the most powerful and wealthy people that this country has known, I don't think so." Look, first of all, I don't understand who this argument is for. The legions of people who are deeply invested in Trump not being indicted, not being charged, but also are galvanized by the idea that people of color are being persecuted in this country as well. I mean, just from a political perspective, I don't know that this is the approach to take. I take her point that the justice system, it has always been unfair and unequally applied, and that historically it is affluent people like Donald Trump who've been able to escape consequences, as he has done. If you look, the first time I think he was ever mentioned in the New York Times was because he was being sued for housing discrimination in some of his apartment buildings in New York. That being said, the way to make equality in this situation, where finally the law is being applied to a more affluent, powerful person like Donald Trump, is to apply it evenly to some of the other powerful people who have not been similarly charged. So the Biden documents case is pending. We don't know if he's going to be charged with anything. We know that Mike Pence is off the hook. That's a choice. He's being treated very differently than Julian Assange. He's being treated very differently than the civil servant whose last name is Fudd that I mentioned.
Reality
back
winner,
in 2000,
Edward Snowden.
We have civil servants taking documents home to work over the weekend who are given 5.5 years in jail. And Mike Pence, who's a former president, the vice president of the United States, who has access to everything under the sun, Joe Biden, the former vice president of the United States, who has boxes of documents next to his car in the garage, and they are being let off the hook in a way that these other members aren't. And no amount of hand-wringing over Donald Trump, given all of the reasons people have that are legitimate to have issues with him, erases the fundamental reality that the law is being selectively applied here.
Has anyone sold out to the mainstream as thoroughly as AOC? It seems like, I mean, I'm not a leftist, so I can't be disappointed in the same way that maybe you can, but it just seems like she's gone with little hesitation or reservation, has gone totally in like an MSNBC or CNN direction. Or it speaks to, those are her people, those are her viewers, and everything she talks about or seems to care about speaks to those people.
It's interesting. Part of the reason I found her to be so appealing when she was running in 2018 was that she spoke very persuasively about the limits of identity politics, surprisingly. It seems difficult to imagine now, but you should go back and watch this interview she did with Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept. Glenn and I were both at The Intercept at the time. And she talked about the ways that identity politics have been weaponized by Democrats in the past. She said that, of course, one's identity, where one comes from, what one's life is like, informs aspects of their life and their politics, but it's not the be-all, end-all, and there are ways the Democratic Party has used identity politics as a shield to absolve itself of its greater responsibility on an economic front. She extemporaneously was saying stuff like this, and I don't know if it's just the years since where she's been in more of an echo chamber of like-minded people in the Democratic Party or in these kind of liberal as opposed to left media circles, increasing distance from DSA, and the DSA's increasing shift toward the center. But there doesn't seem to be any more lefty moderating force on her the way there was when she was running as a candidate mounted by folks like Kyle Kalinske, an independent left media person, and even Cenk Uygur, who I know that there's critiques of TYT as a left organization that's also moved to the center. But that's where she came from. She came from independent internet journalism land, and I can't say that the changes that we can observe now that she's in the MSNBC media land and very rarely does any interviews with anybody in left media have been changes for the better.
Well, we'd be happy to have her here if she ever shows any interest in that. More Rising right after this.